Okay. Oh. Oops. Sorry. Okay. So thank you very much, and thank you for organizing the conference, and also thanks to the previous speakers because the talks were amazing, and now I'm a bit intimidated, but I'll try to do my best. So basically today I will focus on the distinction between empirical and philosophical metaphysical issues in the science of consciousness, in the study of consciousness. I will start by focusing on what we can refer to as the metaphysical turn in recent neuroscience of consciousness, having to do with the fact that some theories in the neuroscience of consciousness include explicit metaphysical claims and desiderata. And this is at odds with another point that is widely acknowledged in the literature, that is the fact that mind-body problem is underdetermined by the evidence we have available and by the evidence that could be provided in the future. A first step towards a solution of this problem is to adopt a strict division of labor between empirical and metaphysical aspects. And I think this division of labor is best understood in terms of a difference in models of explanations that are employed. And I will argue that if the neuroscience of consciousness has to adopt some sort of metaphysical framework, then it has to do a supervenience-based form of agnosticism. So starting with the metaphysical turn. Of course, I'm concerned with the mind-body problem and the different solutions that have been provided to the problem. We are all familiar with them. In this talk, I will focus on physicalism and dualism for the sake of simplicity, but everything I will say should be applicable to other views as well. Now, what about the neuroscience of consciousness? In the last decades, a plethora of theories concerning the neural basis of behavior of consciousness have been provided. And as we can see from this reconstruction, physicalism is the view that has influenced, motivated, inspired the majority of neuroscientific models of consciousness. But a distinction can be traced between two different attitudes. On the one hand, we have some sort of physicalist leaning, so to say, that consists in emphasizing the explanatory power of brain science and dismissing non-physicalist views as anachronistic and anti-scientific. And this is mainly motivated by some sort of caricatural picture of what non-physicalism is. However, there is a second attitude that consists in explicitly including metaphysical commitments in neuroscientific theories and putting forward explicit metaphysical desiderata in the neuroscience of consciousness. And this is the attitude that I think creates the problem, and this is the attitude that I will focus upon. And I will discuss it by means of a couple of examples. The first theory I want to consider is integrated information theory. And luckily, I don't have to spend too much time on that because Nicola has already introduced it. And in particular, I will focus on, I'm interested in focusing on the central identity claim that is posited by IT, according to which any experience is identical to the maximally reducible cause-effect structure associated with the physical system in that state. Now, we don't need to know what a maximally reducible cause-effect structure is in order to appreciate the metaphysical import of this claim. What is done here in the theory, and this is the official version of the theory, is to establish a token identity between conscious states and informational causal properties of the physical system. So in addition to finding the correlates, the conditions of consciousness, IAT tells us what consciousness is, and the metaphysical commitment is a token identity one. But IAT is not the only case of a metaphysical committed theory in neuroscience. Recently, Anil Seth, a leading neuroscientist of consciousness, has defended a new way to study consciousness, and in particular to search for the neural correlates of consciousness, that is the real problem approach. So according to Seth, the real problem approach consists in aiming at explaining, predicting, and controlling the phenomenological features, properties of a conscious experience, and this is done by establishing some fine-grained mappings between them and physical features. So it is a systematic approach to the search of neural correlates. Instead of searching for a correlates of general conscious phenomena, we try to establish some correlations between very specific features of conscious phenomena and very specific neural mechanism. For example, when we focus on color vision, we try to isolate the phenomenological component of, say, the experience of saturation, and we try to map that component into a very precise neural mechanism. So the results should be a very, very precise overview of what are the neural correlates of the different features of our conscious life. So according to Seth, the real problem is distinct from the R problem because it does not focus on why and how consciousness is part of the universe, at least not directly, but of course it is distinct from the easy problem as well, for it doesn't sweep the subjective aspect of consciousness away under the carpet. And in fact, the subjective aspect of consciousness is the explanatory. Now, what about the metaphysical import of this approach? According to Seth, and here I'm quoting from his latest book, the ambition of the real problem approach is that as we build even sturdier explanatory bridges from the physical to the phenomenological, the R problem intuition that consciousness can never be understood in physical terms will fade away, eventually vanishing in a puff of metaphysical smoke. So here the idea is that with this systematic approach to the search of the neural correlates, when we will be able to establish these strict correlations between precise features of consciousness and precise neural mechanisms, we will get to a physicalist dissolution of the hard problem of consciousness. And this is clearly a metaphysical desideratum of the theory that Seth's defend, that is more precisely the control hallucination view. But the details can be overlooked for our purpose. Now, all of this is a problem because, as widely acknowledged in the literature, the mind-body problem is underdetermined by empirical evidence. I don't want to spend too much on this, but as far as I can see, the best way to see the point consists in considering that at least two possible metaphysical explanations can be provided for psychoneural correlations. On the one hand, one could interpret correlations in terms of metaphysical necessity, the claim that mental properties are metaphysically necessitated by physical properties. This is the claim that is typically endorsed by the physicalists and mutatis mutandis by advocates of constitutive panpsychism. And of course, if we have metaphysical necessity, we observe correlations. However, this is not the only way to explain psychoneural correlations unraveled by neuroscience. As a matter of fact, one could also claim that mental properties, and by mental properties I refer, of course, to conscious properties, that mental properties are a distinct kind of fundamental properties that are just nomologically necessitated by physical properties. And this is the nomological necessity thesis that is typically endorsed by the dualists, and again, mutatis mutandis, by advocates of emergentist panpsychism. Now, what is the point with underdetermination? The point is that the empirical evidence that we have available and that we could have available in the future inevitably concerns correlations in the actual world, that is by definition the only world that is empirically accessible. However, the problem is that both metaphysical necessity and nomological necessity entail as a prediction that we will observe correlations in the actual world. The difference between metaphysical necessity and nomological necessity, in addition to the fundamentality of consciousness, is what goes on in worlds other than the actual one. But by definition, these worlds are beyond what we can empirically investigate by empirical means. And so we can see in which sense we have underdetermination, because these two theses are equally compatible with the empirical evidence that could be provided and that has been provided. Now, this is the general point, but we can apply it to more specific cases. Consider IT again. According to the proponents of IT, there is some evidence in favor of the theory. For example, it has been shown that the presence and the absence of consciousness correlate with the brain's capacity for information integration. Although here the measurement is a problem, but I will just take this for granted. Again, it has been shown that certain regions of the brain are involved in the production, so to say, although I don't want to go too causal here, of consciousness, whereas other regions are not involved. For example, if we stimulate the cerebral cortex, we bring about changes in the content of consciousness. And if the cortex has some lesion, then we will probably have a disruption of consciousness. The same is not true for the cerebellum that has way more neurons than the cortex. And the explanation provided by AT is that the cerebellum, as other regions, is not necessary for consciousness because, and does not allow for consciousness to emerge because it has a fit-for architecture that does not allow for a high level of information integration. And according to AT, information integration is necessary for consciousness. Now, let us assume that these pieces of evidence and all the other evidence that has been provided in favor of IT is specific enough for IT, which is far from obvious because different theories nowadays converge towards the importance of information integration and complexity. However, let us assume that this is specific enough. The problem is that this evidence seems to support an empirical version of IT that takes complexity, information integration, and to be markers of consciousness, or correlates of consciousness, or sine qua non conditions for consciousness. But it does not support fundamental IT, I'm borrowing terminology from some papers that have been published on the matter, that is the official version of IT, that is the version of IT including the identity claim. As a matter of fact, at best, this empirical evidence can provide us with support for believing that complexity, information integration are there whenever we have consciousness. But from here to inferring that consciousness is token identical with some causal informational features of the system, well, in that case, we need something else. And that something else cannot be provided by empirical evidence. And this is a problem for two distinct reasons. On the one hand, theories provided in neuroscience are supposed to be empirical, and therefore they are subject to empirical standards of justification. And so the fact that they include claims that cannot be empirically supported or falsified is a problem. And in addition, by including metaphysical commitments into our theories in neuroscience, we are basically adding more ways in which our theories could go wrong. And for example, IT maybe false due to the fact that the central identity does not hold, even if it is an empirically accurate theory. And so we have this problem. And as far as I can see, the first step towards a solution is to adopt a strict division of labor. And in order to see this, I want to consider the question, what does it take to explain consciousness? And I want to consider a toy explanation. A subject S is experiencing M, which is a conscious state, because S is in the neural state N. Now, as far as I can see, there are at least two things that have to be done in order to account for the reason why the conscious state M is instantiated. On the one hand, we have to specify the physica relata. That is, basically, we have to search for the neural correlates of M. And this is the empirical problem. However, there is also something else that has to be done, that is specifying the relation that holds between M and N. So in a sense here, our focus is on the because. We want to know the reason why, the deep reason why, whenever we have N, then we have M. And this is a distinctively philosophical problem. As far as I can see, addressing these two problems requires to adopt two different models of explanation. On the one hand, when it comes to searching for the neural correlates, what we look for are carbon law explanations. So basically some explanations that tell us that when a certain conscious state is instantiated, then we have some physical conditions that are there, and we have some law-like generalization that tell us that when we have those physical conditions, then we have the conscious state. This is the standard understanding of carbon law explanation. In addition to this, we have metaphysical explanation focusing on the nature of the relation between conscious and physical states. We need to account for the very reason why the generalization that we use in covering law explanations holds. And what is interesting is that these two questions are irreducible to each other. we can have very precise covariant law explanation of conscious state and yet be completely ignorant about the very nature of the relation between conscious state and physical goings on. And vice versa, metaphysics is useless when it comes to the search for the neural correlates, when it comes to the search for the physica relata. We may come to know somehow what is the very nature of the dependence between mental and physical states, and yet, I mean, that doesn't involve any progress on when it comes to finding the neural correlates of consciousness. And so, contra Seth, it really seems that squeezing a solution to the mind-body problem out of covariant law explanation requires some sort of explanatory magic. There are two different kinds of explanation. We cannot have the pretension to have a clear idea on the nature of the relation by having very precise covariant law explanations that connect very specific features of consciousness to very specific neural mechanism. And so the suggestion that comes natural is that the neuroscience of consciousness should provide covariant law explanations for the instantiation of conscious phenomena without trying to account for the relation between consciousness and the brain. That is another question, that is a metaphysical question that cannot be answered by empirical means. And so this is the division of labor. However, there is a problem, and the problem is that this division of labor is very hard to achieve because on the one hand, as we have seen, metaphysical commitments are problematic in neuroscience. On the other hand, it seems that neuroscience needs a metaphysical framework for the interpretation of its results. I mean, the very search for the neural correlates of consciousness seems to be meaningful only if we assume that the correlations that are unraveled are not the result of mere coincidence. The search for neural correlates is meaningful only if we are assuming that there is actually some kind of dependence between mental and physical goings on, even if we do not go into the details of that dependence, but some dependence has to be assumed. And so I will argue that this metaphysical assumption that backs the research in neuroscience should be an assumption of a supervenience-based moderate form of agnosticism. So the claim I wish to start from is the following: mental properties supervene on physical properties. And I mean, as we know, this implies that necessarily if we have a physical property, then the mental property supervening on that physical property is instantiated. Now, this seems to be the typically physicalist claim, and in fact, physicalism has often been defined as the commitment to supervenience, but as we've seen, two senses of necessity have to be kept apart. On the one hand, we have the metaphysical necessitation view, according to which this implication, if P then M, holds in all possible words. Here we have represented the totality of possible words. But we also have the nomological necessitation thesis, according to which the if P then M implication holds in the actual word and in words that are nomologically alike. But, and this is a crucial component of for example, say, dualist proposals, there is at least one possible word in which we have the physical property, but we don't have the conscious property we are interested in. And this is Chalmers' zombie word, for example. Now, as we've seen, assuming MN or NN is problematic in the context of neuroscientific theories because of the reasons that we have seen a couple of slides ago. And so my proposal is to adopt something in between metaphysical necessitation and nomological necessitation, and more precisely to adopt the claim that mental properties supervene at least with nomological necessity on physical properties. And this is supervenience-based agnosticism. Basically, just like in the dualist picture, we have that the if P then M implication holds in the actual word, and maybe in words that are nomologically alike, but we can discuss on this. But when it comes to what goes on in other possible words, we just remain agnostic. We don't say anything. It could be that mental properties metaphysically supervene on physical properties, and so we have the if P then M implications holding in no implication holding in all possible words. Or otherwise, it could be that just like in the dualist picture, there are some words in which the implication fails to obtain. What is crucial is that this form of agnosticism maintains that there is a this-worldly dependence between mental and physical properties, and so it provides us with the minimally sufficient background for interpreting the results provided by neuroscience. At the same time, maintaining an agnostic component, that is, it doesn't tell us what goes on in other possible words. And in addition, even when it comes to the actual word, it leaves supervenience unexplained. As a matter of fact, we just know that mental properties supervene, at least with nomological necessity, on physical properties, but we don't know the reason why this happens. Now, supervenience is a purely modal notion that specifies the way two properties, in this case, covary and co-occur. And one of the drawbacks of supervenience, especially when it comes to debates such as the formulation of physicalism, is that supervenience needs to be further explained from a metaphysical point of view. But here, in this case, the fact that supervenience is a purely modal notion turns out to be extremely useful, because we don't want to be committed to the reason why supervenience falls. It could be that, just like in the physicalist framework, mental properties are grounded or even identical with physical properties, or otherwise it might be that, just like in the dualist picture, mental properties are a distinct kind of fundamental properties, and we have some contingent psychophysical laws that determine the way mental properties and physical properties covary. We just remain silent of all of this, and this is the second agnostic aspect of the thesis. However, it is a moderate form of agnosticism because some kind of metaphysical commitment is involved, in addition to supervenience. And more precisely, I am referring to realism about mental properties. It will make little sense to say that mental properties supervene on physical properties if mental properties were not there. The claim would be either false or nonsensical. And so agnosticism, this kind of agnosticism, is moderate because it isn't compatible with forms with metaphysical eliminativism about the existence of conscious properties. Now, as far as I can see, adopting this kind of view as the default framework for the neuroscience of consciousness has some advantages. First of all, it averts the risk of making empirically inaccessible substantial assumptions, while at the same time allowing us to interpret the search for neural correlates in a meaningful way. Also, this view is metaphysically flexible. It can accommodate the majority of the views that are discussed in contemporary metaphysics of mind. It can accommodate physicalism, can accommodate dualism, panpsychism, and so on. As I've said, it cannot accommodate eliminativism. But I mean, I had to stop somewhere. And also, it allows to set a precise agenda for the neuroscience of consciousness. It provides neuroscience with the necessary metaphysical framework, and that being the situation, neuroscience can focus on providing common law explanation of consciousness without taking care of the nature of the relation. And so adopting this agnosticism allows us to respect the division of labor I have outlined. Clearly, one could say that agnosticism is a bad metaphysical theory because it is too permissive, and that it is a bad empirical hypothesis because it is untestable. However, on the one hand, it isn't true that agnosticism is untestable because it has some empirically falsifiable implications. For example, we cannot, if we maintain agnosticism, then it is impossible that we find that two identical physical states can instantiate two different mental states. In this case, agnosticism, together with the majority of the claims that have been made in recent philosophy of mind, would be falsified. And this fact that there are some empirically falsifiable implications is given by the fact that there is some metaphysical commitment in agnosticism, as we've seen, the commitment to realism and to supervenience. However, the real reply to this kind of objection is, that's fine. I mean, agnosticism is neither a metaphysical theory nor an empirical hypothesis. It is supposed to be a framework for the neuroscience of consciousness, but of course, it is not satisfying as a solution to the mind-body problem. However, that's fine because metaphysical inquiry on the mind-body problem is a different kind of work that, as I've said, is distinct from the kind of work that neuroscience is doing when trying to isolate the neural basis of consciousness. So, taking stock, we have seen that there is a potential tension in the neuroscience of consciousness, given by the fact that metaphysical assumptions and desiderata that can become integral parts of the theories in neuroscience are taught with the underdetermination problem. Then I've suggested that there are two models of explanation in consciousness science that suggest in its turn a precise division of labor between metaphysics and neuroscience. And finally, I have argued that supervenience-based agnosticism should be the default metaphysical framework for the scientific study of consciousness, and more precisely for the neuroscientific study of consciousness. So thank you for your attention, and if you want to reach me, feel free to do it.